Hi everyone, for today's lesson we are going to do an investigation or a discovery activity about angle pair relationships. Before you get started, please make sure that you have already completed the angle pair relationships vocab video lesson. For this vocab video lesson, we learned about 4 different types of angles. Those angles are created whenever we are working with a transversal line that cuts through more than one line. Whenever that happens, 4 different angle relationships are created. The first type is corresponding angles. Corresponding angles are angles that have similar positions, like what we have here. So with respect to the intersection of the transversal and the line that it is crossing, angles that are in a similar position are called corresponding angles. These angles are always on the same side of the transversal line. The next type are alternate interior angles. Alternate interior angles are on opposite sides of the transversal line, but between the 2 lines that the transversal is cutting through. These alternate interior angles form a diagonal. Alternate exterior angles, they are also on opposite sides of the transversal line, and they also would form a diagonal, but they are on the outside of the lines that the transversal is cutting through. So they would form a diagonal, they are on opposite sides of the transversal, and they are on the outside, not the inside or between. They're on the outside of the lines that the transversal is cutting through. And finally, we had consecutive interior angles. Consecutive interior angles, they are on the interior, so between the 2 lines that the transversal is cutting through, and they're on the same side of the transversal line. Consecutive interiors. So, we are going to be working with all of these relationships and investigating what happens if the lines that we are talking about that are being cut by the transversal are parallel versus not parallel. So the first thing that we're going to do is I would always recommend that you have some color with you, and then if you have access to a protractor, please use a protractor. Otherwise, just use the same values that I have in this lesson. So the first thing we want to do is we want to use our straight edge to construct a pair of non-parallel lines. So non-parallel lines are 2 lines that do not intersect each other, or they could intersect each other. So we want non-parallel. Parallel means that we would not anticipate them intersecting. And we want them to be intersected by a transversal line. And now what we're going to do is we are going to label our angles in the following way. We're going to label this angle 1, angle 2, angle 3, and angle 4. Angle 5, angle 6, angle 7, and angle 8. So please make sure that your angles match my angles. The next thing we want to do, now that we've numbered our angles 1 through 8, is we want to analyze the corresponding angles. So let's go ahead and look for a pair of corresponding angles and see what happens. How about angle 1 and angle 5? So I'm going to identify the measure of angle 1. And according to what I see here, it looks like angle 1 is about 60 degrees. So I'm going to rate that the measure of angle 1 is equal to 60 degrees. Now I'm going to look for the measure of angle 5. And according to this, it looks like angle 5 is about maybe 87 degrees. So with angle 1 being 60 and angle 5 being 87, I'm going to say, explain how the measures of the corresponding angles compare. Well, they have nothing in common. They're not supplementary. They're not congruent. So how they compare is they are different measures. Now let's go ahead and analyze a pair of alternate interior angles. So we're just identifying a pair. So we don't need to look at all of them, just a pair. And I know that angle 4 and angle 6, they are alternate interior angles. So let me go ahead and see if I can find this measure. It might require me to flip this upside down. And it appears that the measure of angle 4 is about 120 degrees. So now I'm going to go ahead and look at the measure of angle 6, because angle 6 is an alternate interior angle. So let's go ahead and look at the measure of angle 6. See what I can do to get this angle measure. And it appears that this angle, it looks like it is about I know it's kind of hard to read. Well, it's bigger than 90, so then that makes it about maybe 90. It doesn't look like it's quite 95, maybe 93. It's about 93 degrees. So how does 120 and 93 compare? Well, once again, they are different measures. So now let's go ahead and look at alternate exterior angles. Alternate exterior angles would be like angle 1 and angle 7. So I'm going to go ahead and look at angle 1, which the measure of angle 1 we already know is 60 degrees. So now let's go ahead and find the measure of angle 7. And the measure of angle 7 appears to be about 87 degrees. Which that makes sense because of the fact that angle 5 and angle 7, they are vertical angles. And we know that vertical angles are congruent. So once again, we have different measures. How are they related? They are different measures. So now let's go ahead and look at consecutive interior angles. Remember, consecutive interior angles are on the inside and the same side of the transversal. So I already know what the measure of angle 4 is. That's 120 degrees. And I already know what the measure of angle 5 is. That's 87 degrees. And it's asking to explain the relationship between consecutive interior angles. And I see that they are different measures. The question is, do consecutive interior angles form a linear pair? No, they do not form a line. Are they supplementary? Do they add to 180? So they're not a linear pair. And 120 plus 87, that is equal to 207 degrees, which is not 180 degrees. So therefore, no, these are not supplementary angles. So the whole point of this exercise is to say that we have non-parallel lines, and all that we can conclude is that vertical angles are congruent. But there's nothing else to really talk about because we always ended up with different measures each time. So now let's go ahead and flip the page. And this time, we want to use a straight edge to construct a pair of parallel lines intersected by a transversal. So I'm going to do the very best I can to draw two parallel lines. That is cut by a transversal. And we're going to label our angles the exact same way that we did before. Here's angle 1, 2, 3, and 4. 5, 6, 7, and 8. And these two angles are parallel, so we're going to put in our parallel symbols. And now we're going to analyze our corresponding angles. So our corresponding angles that we used last time were angle 1 and angle 5. So let's go ahead and find their measures. So it looks like the measure of angle 1 appears to be about 55 degrees. And the measure of angle 5 also appears to be about 55 degrees. So explain how the measures of corresponding angles compare. Well, if we have parallel lines, then they appear to have the same measure. And if they have the same measure, what we can say is that if you have parallel lines, then corresponding angles are congruent to each other. And you're welcome to check a different pair of corresponding angles and see if they match. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark up this picture. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 5. Next, I'm going to analyze alternate interior angles. So I'm going to go ahead and look at angle 4 and angle 6 just like I did last time. So I'm going to look at angle 4. And it appears to be about 125 degrees. So now I'm going to go ahead and look at the measure of angle 6, because these two angles are alternate interior angles. And once again, it appears to be about 125 degrees. Which they are the same measure. And so therefore, I can say that if we have parallel lines, then alternate interior angles are congruent. So I'm going to go ahead and mark those angles up. Angle 4 is going to be congruent with angle 6. Next, I'm going to look at alternate exterior angles. And I believe that I worked with angle 1 and angle 7 last time. The measure of angle 1, that is equal to 55 degrees. We've already measured that. And now I'm going to look at the measure of angle 7. We can probably anticipate that 5 and 7 have the same measure because they're vertical angles. But for this activity, we want to make sure that we are accurate. So I'm going to go ahead and check. And yes, it looks like it's about 55 degrees. So the measure of angle 7 is equal to 55 degrees. So how are the measures? How do they compare? They are the same measure. So we can say that if you have parallel lines, then alternate exterior angles are congruent. So now we're going to go ahead and analyze consecutive interior angles. And the consecutive interior angles I worked with last time were angle 4 and angle 5. And I know that the measure of angle 4 is equal to 125 degrees, and the measure of angle 5 equals 55 degrees. Explain how they compare. Well, they are different measures. They are not congruent. They are still different measures. So now, do consecutive interior angles form a linear pair? No, they're still not a linear pair. Because together they do not form a line, they're just adjacent angles. But are they supplementary? Well, what's 125 plus 55? 125 plus 55, that is equal to 180 degrees. So although they have different measures, those measures have a relationship. That means that if you have parallel lines, then consecutive interior angles are supplementary. Consecutive interior angles are supplementary. So consecutive interior angles are the only angles that are going to always have a different measure. But if you know that you have parallel lines, then consecutive interior angles will add to equal 180 degrees. And so that is the end of today's lesson. The whole point of this lesson was just to show that if you don't have parallel lines, then you cannot make an assumption about the relationships between these angle pairs. But if you do have parallel lines, then we can say corresponding angles are congruent, alternate interior angles are congruent, alternate exterior angles are congruent, and consecutive interior angles are supplementary. And that is the end of today's lesson. If you have any questions over anything I just showed you, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day.